Hello and welcome to this video. My name's Barry Beckham. Let's take a look at one of the images from my last video and process that through Adobe Camera Raw. The images I am referring to are those that were shot using the Canon R5 mirrorless camera with the 100 to 500mm zoom plus a ×2 converter. And I'd like to concentrate on an image shot at 2000 ISO and at a focal length of 1000mm. This is the image I've chosen, opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, but what software you're using really isn't the issue. What we need to do with a raw image like this is much the same no matter what software we use. Now this water bird is called a Janica, the Bigfoot of the bird world it seems, and it's a long way away from me. Even using a 1000mm lens combination, I don't have a frame filling shot. But what I do have is a handheld sharp image, which was the point of my last video. In that previous video, I never cropped any images because the object of the exercise was to show you the true capabilities of the lens combined with that converter. Here it's a little bit different, so a crop makes a bit more sense. We'll also take a look at the noise suppression too. Now I think the image editing is remarkably straightforward with these types of images. And you could say all this really needs is a few minor edits. Let's start with a crop. Selecting the crop from the top right, we get the crop bounding box and we can drag in one of the corner toggles, but we can actually go onto the picture, click and drag, and sort of recreate a second one which takes over from the one you saw. What I'm looking for here is the right sort of crop for this image. You can see I'm taking just a small amount of this frame, but don't forget we did start off with an R5 image of 45 million pixels. So I can afford to crop down quite tight, given the size of the bird too. Let's come up a little bit and move around and find a nice spot. That looks pretty good with the bird's head very close to that strong point over on the left hand side. I've got a nice bit of reflection of the bird here. I think we're going to have to deal with a little highlight at the top right, but that's no big deal. We can see the ripples of the water at a diagonal. Do we want to straighten those up a little bit? Personal choice. Let's have a look. Just click and rotate a little bit just to level them up. Does it look better or worse? To be honest, I don't think there's much in it, so it's a personal call, I guess. But what I'm going to do next is to hit the Enter key to commit that crop and Control 0 to fit the image on screen. And the one thing we can see is that we do have a nice image with which to proceed with. What I've discovered using the Canon R5 is sometimes I feel it gives just a little bit more magenta than I would like. If you look just below the legs of the bird, can we just see a hint of magenta in the water there? It's not great here, but I mention it because I generally have to make a tweak of the tint. Now I'm going to put my cursor in the box there because I'm going to use the down arrow because I only want to change this a little bit. Something like that, and I can see a difference already. Not great, I admit, but it's just a personal preference. It was a nice sunny day. And I think I could also do with just a little bit of an increase in the temperature. So let's just warm up the temperature just a touch. Now, one of the things I often do with pictures like this is I try the auto setting up to the right of the word edit just above my cursor. Because if it does a good job, I can move on from that point. But if it doesn't, I can back away from it and do my own thing. Let's give it a whirl. Just click on the auto. Now that looked pretty good to me. It's made a few adjustments down here. It's tweaked the contrast, it's brought the highlights down, shadows up a little bit. That's the sort of thing I would have been doing anyway. It's brought the whites up a little bit and we've got quite a bit of sparkle through the entire image, and it's took the blacks down. The one thing it's done is just lost a bit of detail in the back side of the bird and a little bit near the bird's eye. Let's deal with that. I'm quite happy with the changes that automatic setting has made. Maybe I'll add a little bit of clarity, but you can see it's not a difficult manipulation to do. So with the zoom tool selected, I'm going to click and drag to get the back of the bird very big. And now we can begin to see a little bit of that noise because we're well above 100% zoom factor at the moment. So I need to select my adjustment brush from the top right. I'm going to make a guess at the settings that I want because they're always changeable when we're working with raw files. But it's obvious that I'm going to want to bring down the highlights a little bit, so let's step them down. And I may need to take the exposure as well. As I say, we can adjust these. I always keep my flow rate very low so I can apply the changes in a tempered and measured way. There's my brush, which I'll increase the size of using the square bracket keys to the right of the letter P. Now I can work on this area and just bring through the tones that I think I need in the areas that I think I need them. Just concentrating on these little white areas here. You can see what I'm doing is very gradual, and to be honest, it's always the best way to work like that. If you try to do this sort of thing too fast, things tend to run away from us and we end up overdoing it. It's not a big deal if we do that, of course, because one of the other tools we've got up on the right hand side next to the brush is an eraser. So if I did overdo it in one place, I can go and erase it. Now I've actually done the masking, I could see if bringing down the exposure a little more is something I want. Just a touch, look, and that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to try and use the same settings for the head of the bird because it's the same sort of highlight. Touching the space bar, I can click and drag, leave the image enlarged like this, drop the size of the brush down again, square bracket keys once again, and I can just paint over this area until I feel I've got those light areas just covered nicely. Just making sure we maintain the quality. It's great when we can do this with raw files nowadays. We see these white areas and we think we've lost detail completely, but sometimes it's amazing how much is still there. So I'm going to hit Ctrl-0 and we'll just have a timeout and just have a look around the image and decide what we need to do next. Now I'd like to do a fair bit of shading around the edges of the image, but I also need to deal with that noise, and I don't think it matters too much which way round we deal with these. So I'm going to go back to my original tabs by going up to the top right and clicking this little icon up here. I'm going to go down to the Detail tab and I'm going to zoom into the image. I'll right click and I'm going to zoom to 100%. So there we can see the body of the bird and we can see noise in the background. One of the things I've noticed about the R5 is when I've used a high ISO, when I do get noise, as we can see here, it's a clean noise. I'm almost never reaching for any of the options like the color noise reduction or any other options within that, which are detail, smoothness, and the color noise reduction. I tend to not need those at all. All I really want is this. And I seem to be settling on a value between about 20 and 30. So what I'm going to do here is go right in the middle of that and dial in 25. Now, if you were looking into the center of the image, you'll see the change. Let me double click to reset that. There's the noise before. there's the noise after 25. Of course, with noise reduction, we can push it up much further. The trouble with that is, if we're not careful, in my view, we can start to make the image look a little bit cartoon-like. So I think we need to go as far as we dare. I think perhaps we could get to 30 and still be reasonably happy with the result. So let me settle on 30. There you can still see a little bit of noise in the background, which, to be honest, our eyes are always used to seeing anyway, to some degree. Let me right click and fit this back in view. Now the shading. We could use the radial filter here. We could select the radial filter from the right hand side, draw a selection around the bird and darken down all of the edges and the corners. I'm going to use the graduated filter because I tend to want to give one side more than the other, and I find this is often a little more convenient. Let me demonstrate that by picking up the gradient filter, and from the top of the screen I'm going to click and drag. Now I'm just coming down over the bird to a level where this gradient, when I apply some to the top, may just affect the bird. Let's take a look. I want to take down the exposure here, and that looks pretty good, but it is affecting the head of the bird, and although it's doing the job I want it to do, it's overdoing it up in the top right corner. So that's when I reach for the eraser. We can work with a I'll say that again. We can work with a brush, and you can see that I've got the flow rate down quite low, and you can see the minor. So I can sweep over this area and I can take away the worst of that shading, leaving just what I want. When it comes to the bird, I can do the same thing. Just lift the head again. Maybe I should make a bigger brush. Just make sure that I'm not darkening one of the most important parts of the image that I want to stand out. So that's not working too badly at all. I'm going to go back now and reselect the graduated filter because I want to put one on the bottom. Click and drag up from the bottom. Now what I'm going to do here is to go over and drop the highlights, and maybe I'll drop the exposure even a little more because I've got a pretty solid top part of my image, so I can afford to have a slightly stronger base because it holds everything nicely in. Now with that selection still made on the graduated filter, I'm going to click and drag from the left in. Now that's a little bit too heavy for what I want. We can either go to the right hand side and double click the sliders we can see that have been moved, the exposure and the highlights, but if we just right click within the bounding box, we can reset them from here. So if you've got a number of others included in the change, you can shut them all off in that way. All I need to do here is a little bit of exposure. I don't want too much, just a nice little bit of a vignette on the left edge, and then I'm going to do the same on the right. And I don't always need exactly the same here, so I could end up backing off. It looks pretty good, but I've darkened that top corner again. So once again, I'm going to pick up my eraser and just lighten that. I want it dark, but I don't want it so it's got big black lumps in it. It just doesn't look quite right. I'm going to go back to the icon at the top right because I think we need a timeout. Just a second or two to observe the image and see if there's anything we need to do with this before we open this up into Photoshop. Now there's just one thing I think. There's the nature of this bird. It's got a nice bright neck, but the crown of its head is dark. And I wonder if I can just do something to lift the tones there a little bit. You can see I'm bringing the image up fairly large here. I'm going to pick my adjustment brush. I'm going to go down to the shadows, just lift the shadows just a tiny amount and the exposure a tiny amount. All I'm looking to do is just lift things around here. Just a little bit, bring a little bit more light through here. I don't want to adjust the eye at all. Maybe the outside edge, but I don't want to touch that pupil. It's nice and dark and giving us a bit of contrast. So maybe around the edge is good, but that's about all I would be prepared to do. Just lifting that a little bit. I think what I'll do from here, I'm going to open this directly into Photoshop. Now there's a couple of areas of this image I'd like to deal with next. We've got this white out of focus area at the top right corner, which is quite distracting, and a little bit of lightness along the top edge. I think that can be burned in quite easily, but the reason I never dealt with this light top right corner in Adobe Camera Raw is because Content Aware Fill is so good at this, I think it will probably do a quick and easy job. So I'm going to go over to my toolbox and select my lasso tool. I just need to make a quick selection to say to Photoshop, deal with that top corner for me. Then we need to go up to Edit, Content Aware Fill. The repair comes from the left side, and let me move this out of the way because it's covering up all my controls. There you can see the repair it's doing up at the top. But there you can see the repair it's done. You can hardly see what work it has done. So over here I've got the auto setting checked, which works for me 9 times out of 10. So all I'm going to do is to output this back to the current layer. We can make another layer if there's a need to, but there isn't here. So let's just click OK and apply that change. Control D will remove that selection. Now I need just 1 or 2 touches with the burn tool. So if we go over to the toolbox on the left hand side, there's the one I want. If you look up at the top of the screen, you can see in the range I've got midtones, and in the exposure I've got around 10%. I'm going to drop that brush size down a little bit, but just wipe along the top just to take those 2 areas down. Make the brush a little smaller here just to deal with that little streak, just to tone it down. Don't need to take it away, just tone it down a little bit. But I don't think there's a great deal more we can do. The one thing that might be necessary, or should I say desired rather than necessary, a little bit of localized color. Let's finish with that. Let's go back to the same options here and choose the sponge tool. Once again, we've got saturate in the mode at the top left of the screen and a flow of 10%. I'll zoom in just a little bit, drop the brush size down, because what I could do here is just give a little bit of a touch to the colors here, a little bit to the back of the bird, not very much, don't want to overdo this. Control 0 to finish. So here we have the original image I started with. It would have been nice if the bird had come just a bit closer to me, but there'll be another day and I'll be ready with the Canon 100 to 500 and that ×2 converter. But a little cropping, making the most of the pixels we had and the sharpness in the shot. And there's the picture we have. Since I bought my Canon R5 mirrorless camera, it has changed quite a bit the way I approach my photography. When I purchased the 100 to 500mm zoom, I didn't have any intention of following up with a converter. It was only when I was so amazed at the image stabilization that I got from that lens and camera that I went out and bought one. And that confidence hasn't been misplaced. It's all working beautifully. In the past week or 10 days, when I've been out shooting images for the previous video and this one here, I've begun to change my opinion of ISO and handheld long telephotos because of the equipment I'm using. I'm pretty certain I wouldn't have got these results with my old Canon 1DS Mark III. Now I think it's fair to say that I'm a pretty cynical type of person. I need lots of evidence to be convinced that something is better than the next thing. But in my 6 months use of the Canon R5, well, I do have plenty of evidence to support the fact that the image stabilization is absolutely superb, and because of that, it opens up picture opportunities that you may never have had. I'll see you next time.